thank you all for being here this morning. And I am thrilled today to be talking to Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, who has represented Virginia in Congress since 2009 and who has, in that time, often been either the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee or the ranking member. And you remember the ranking member means the top member on the committee from the opposite party than the one that is in control of the Senate. So thank you very much for being here today, Senator Warner. I'm really excited to hear about what you do on that Senate committee.
Well, Heather, thank you for having me, and I appreciate um, your great work and have followed it very closely over the last couple of years. The Senate Intelligence Committee came about in the mid 1970s. In many ways, America, while we had an intelligence agents all the way back to George Washington, we really didn't have a formal separated service until after World War II, and that was with the Central Intelligence Agency. I think anybody who's followed history realizes the CIA, while they had some successes, they had a lot of failures as well. And there was virtually no oversight from Congress of the CIA. In 1975, roughly, there was something called the Church Committee. They'd seen some of the excesses, and they created two standing committees, one in the House, one in the Senate. And what's unique about the Intelligence Committee is, in many ways, we are the only members in the Senate, there are now 17 of us, that get to see classified information. And then there's even a more select subset that is the chair and vice chair that get to see what's called the Gang of Eight material, things that, supposed to see everything basically the president gets to see. So those committees were set up, and our job is to, frankly, be the eyes and the ears for other members who are not on the committee. After 9/11, when there was such an intelligence failure, there was an attempt, and our Intelligence Committee grew from one agency, literally, or now I think 18, 19, I sometimes get it mixed up because you've got every military service has got an intelligence agency. We've got satellite services. We've got, the people that listen in, the National Security Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency. Space Force now has an intelligence component. We said we need to have a better organization. We correct the Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI. That has been of mixed success in terms of trying to coordinate and make sure that we share information appropriately. I had very little background. I was a business guy. I was governor. I was more a numbers nerd, but I got on the intelligence community very early on after I was elected, and it's really become my greatest passion in public service, because not only do we get to look at all the national security issues from how we share information, get information about our adversaries, but in many ways the Intelligence Committee has also become, at least in the Senate, the default technology committee, because as we look particularly in terms of competition with China, around artificial intelligence, quantum computing, AI and bio combined. I was a wireless guy, so the rise of Huawei. National security is more than tanks and guns. It is also technology competition, and we're the entity that really follows a lot of that. And it isn't. It's been frightening at times. It's never dull, and for the most part, particularly until the beginning of this second Trump administration, it has been uniformly bipartisan. Some of that has fallen aside recently, which is really, really disappointing. But it is the one place, because there's not a lot of grandstanding. We go into what's called a SCIF, a secure place. We don't have press, and for the most part, once we have witnesses, you can't tell who's a Democrat and who's a Republican. That's a good thing.
So, can you walk us through a little bit what it looks like to be on the Senate Intelligence Committee? That is, how often do you meet? How do you get information? When do you know something big is going on? When do you feel like you are being shut out of information? What does it look like, literally, to be on the Senate Intelligence Committee? And while you're at it, can you explain to people what the Gang of Eight is? Because you see Gang of Eight all the time. What the Gang of Eight is, and again, how the Gang of Eight gets alerted to something extraordinary that the rest of the Intelligence Committee will not necessarily be let in on.
Yeah, very good question. We will have 2 to 3 meetings a week. And the chair and the vice chair, usually the chair sets most of the agenda, will have oversight responsibilities that each of the multiple intelligence agencies have to come before us and make their case for financing. They will brief us on state of the world and by their domain, either by geographic domain or if it's satellite. And then I will spend on top of that, because literally dozens of hours a week, not informal meetings where I'm getting direct briefings or reaching out. Again, my particularly interest is around technology competition with China. The Gang of Eight was set up because there are certain things that are so sensitive that an administration says we don't even want to share that with the whole intelligence committees in the House and the Senate. And the Gang of Eight includes the Speaker and the Minority Leader, the Senate Majority Leader, Minority Leader, and then the four key people from the House Intelligence Committee, chairs and ranking members of the House and the Senate. And that is supposed to be the group, if the president is going to do for example, a bombing of Iran, we're supposed to be notified first in terms of congressional delegation. One of the things that's very concerning to me right now is, we've had no real briefing on Venezuela. And if the president is planning on action there, it is not just tradition, but it's the law that we're supposed to be kept informed. Uniquely enough, the Gang of Eight during the second Trump administration has not been, there have been a number of times where I think there have been major fouls in terms of how information has been briefed, or it's just briefed to one party. The first Trump administration was actually quite good at keeping Congress informed. It is a night and day experience between Trump 1 and Trump 2.
So before we get into that, I'd like you to go back just for a second and talk about how many different intelligence components there are to the U.S. government, because that became very clear, I think, when President Trump was charged with retaining classified documents, and the number of agencies that were had some of their information compromised was really astonishing. And you have mentioned the people who look at satellite imagery, for example, as being different than the CIA. I don't remember how many agencies there are, but I think that's worth emphasizing for people, that we have a very large intelligence community. And then talking perhaps a little bit about why. Why does it matter that we have this intelligence?
Well, we have 18 different agencies inside the federal government that are intelligence agencies. The original, well, actually, the original came out of the State Department. But we have the CIA, which most people are familiar with. CIA is supposed to be doing human intelligence, the act of spying, espionage. They also create the gadgets. If you're a James Bond fan, there are those equivalents. We have intelligence components of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. We have, in terms of satellites, we have one organization, National Reconnaissance Organization, that basically puts the satellites, either launches them or uses commercial satellites for the overhead spying. Then we have something called the NGA, the National Geospatial Agency, that literally takes the pixels and tries to analyze them. So you don't want to make sure that the satellites are capturing and analyzing all the information. So you've got a different entity there. You have the National Security Agency, which is where we've had breaches in the past, where you have listening in, and again, this goes to the heart of a series of protections, so that our government can't listen in on American domestic conversations, but can listen in oftentimes on foreign conversations if there is identified targets. We have the FBI that has components that does domestic, but also have some components in terms of how our foreign intelligence intersects with domestic intelligence. Remember, it was the CIA and the FBI that didn't share intelligence enough that many people said led to 9/11, because we had, following the terrorists, when they came to America, the FBI was supposed to pick up and people didn't share. We have the State Department, for example, has an intelligence component. The Defense Intelligence Agency, which is separate from the intelligence agencies of the individual services, are the folks who are like oftentimes the military attaches at embassies that also have an intelligence function. We then, I've not named them all right now, Space Force, there are The Energy Department has a component because of the challenge around nuclear weapons. But the big ones are the CIA, the NSA, the NRO and NGA to combined, and FBI, and then defense intelligence agencies, the big, five or six. What was interesting with the director of national intelligence, we said we weren't sharing enough. So this office was created, and it was supposed to kind of coordinate. It doesn't have direct budgetary control over all of these entities, but it is supposed to be the coordinating body. And depending on who's been the head of the director of national intelligence, it really is as much a convener and a personality driven, because if an agency doesn't do what the ODNI says, you know, the ODNI director doesn't have any ability to kind of cut off the money. So it's an imperfect solution, but it's much better than it was 20 years ago. So that's
So
the structure.
so why? Why do we need all this? And where I'm really going with this is the sense that one gets from this administration that protecting the country is about big bangs, when the history of our country suggests that, in fact, nothing is more important than alliances and information. Am I right in that?
Amen. You are so right. And we have, the three biggest services in the world are the Americans, the Chinese, and the Russians. Um, and we are, I think, still the best, but we are the best not only because the men and women who serve, but because we have strong alliances. We have our tightest alliances are with the other English speaking democracies in the world, the British, um, the Australians, the Canadians, the New Zealanders. They're called the Five Eye partners. And, you know, we share very easily. We have lesser sharing relationships with a lot of our NATO partners. We have strong, obviously, ties with Israel, but we get a lot of information from African country services, other Asian country services, and that helps us. And why we have so many of these different agencies is you don't want to simply trust one source. You really do need. There is duplication here on purpose in many ways, because if you simply rely on a CIA agent's tip, um, you could get yourself in harm's way. So we often ask for the analysis of not only the human intelligence, but what's called overhead, oftentimes spying from the sky, and the signals intelligence, which is what the NSA does. And that is all, again, supplemented with our allies' input. And those relationships, that most of them with our allies, are based upon trust, not based upon some legally binding obligation. And one of the things that's been so troublesome with the Trump administration is the kind of disrespect of our allies. The fact that the president's been so disrespectful for Canada, towards Canada, and of all countries, Canada, to the point of saying at some point Canada maybe shouldn't be in the Five Eyes. That's ridiculous. It's insane. And the job of the intelligence community at the end of the day is not the big bang, as you indicated, Heather. It really is to keep policymakers, starting with the president, but also the Congress, and also our military leadership, informed. We're all the customers of the intelligence community, so that we can have the best insights into what policy actions we should take. And the last point, and this is probably the most important, is that the intelligence community has to be willing to speak truth to power. Because if the intelligence community is politicized or cooking the books, that could lead to wars like what happened in Iraq, where I'm not saying there was the community itself, but it feels like the policymakers manipulated some of that information and didn't press hard enough. And probably my overarching greatest fear from the Trump administration is that they are undermining that intelligence. We've seen time and again intelligence professionals fired because they wouldn't create a product that fit the president's narrative. That makes us less safe, and it has actually led, and some of this I can talk about, to a number of companies publicly saying they're not sure they're willing to share as much information because they're not sure it'll be kept secret. And they, frankly, in certain cases, have questions about what our goals are, particularly vis-a-vis Russia.
So let's get into that. But I want to pick up something you just said right there, and that is keep us safer. That at the end of the day, the whole point of intelligence is to keep Americans safe,
Yeah.
and that our alliances and our intelligence are really the first line of defense between us and cyber attacks, terrorist
Mhm.
attacks, even
Mhm.
wars. And that, sometimes I think we forget that when we think about spying, that it's
Yeah.
really an attempt to make sure we have the right information to keep this country safe. But so you alluded
And
to
can
a
I just
topic.
add one? Can I add one other just quick
Sure.
addendum to that? And this has been hard for the intelligence community, I think, to fully move. Traditionally, the way you spy on another country is you spy on their government, you spy on their military. Um, Increasingly, if you accept my premise that national security is also about who's going to win the AI race, who's going to win, who's going to crack quantum computing, who's going to have the most advanced telecommunication systems, and all of these technology domains. Because with China, with Russia, we had a military adversary and a ideological adversary. With China, we have a country that is investing at the levels that we used to invest. So we've been trying to move this giant apparatus to say, we also need to figure out and know about, the Chinese uh, AI model DeepSeek that suddenly appeared out of nowhere. We totally got, I think, caught off guard, and particularly in my old area of expertise in telecom, when suddenly this company Huawei caught everybody's attention, and we had no idea how quickly and fast it was coming. So, moving the enterprise to also look at technology competition, we just have not done that well, but we're getting better.
Well, and that leads to the point that when we think about spying, it's not spy versus spy the way it used to be in Mad Magazine, but in
Right,
fact, it's gathering intelligence through relationships
right.
and through real um, scientific techniques and technology and so on. It's a very different world, it seems.
Yes, it is.
So, you have spoken a couple of times now on the floor of the Senate about your concerns about the intelligence community under this second Trump administration. Can you explain to us what's happening and why we should be concerned?
Well, what's happening is, I thought the director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, was totally unequipped to be um, the director of national intelligence. I led an effort. We came very close to defeating her. Because she is a rabid partisan, and she's been a rabid partisan on every. She was a liberal Democrat, and then she's a MAGA person. She has, I would say unusual ties with Russia in terms of the Russian government is constantly, complimenting her. Um, we had that initially. Then we saw, in the early days, people being fired that were young CIA agents, and it takes a couple $100,000 to train a CIA agents, and firing those folks, I think slowed down the human capital input. We've seen early on in the administration senior leaders fired because when they were trying to do an investigation into some of the uh, gangs in Venezuela and their ties to the Maduro government, and Maduro in Venezuela is a bad guy, let's acknowledge that. But they didn't come up with the conclusion that the administration wanted, and they got fired for that. And we've seen people who are undercover have their identities carelessly identified, which puts them in harm's way. And then this kind of evisceration and of the intelligence community really picked up steam in the summer when uniformed military officers, like the head of the National Security Agency, which is both NSA and Cyber Command, got fired for no reason at all, other than this right wing zealot Laura Loomer didn't like him, or the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, who made the assessment of the Iran bombing, saying, it was very powerful, but he wouldn't use the words obliterated, which it was not obliterated, and we know that now, and he got fired for that. And we've seen, at the FBI, enormous loss of all of our, career top officials because they oftentimes wouldn't bend the knee. And all of these actions combined make us, one, less secure, two, makes our intelligence partners around the world really concerned about what the hell's going on here. This has never happened at this level before. And then, three, it's, I'll cite the FBI for an example. When you take in some field offices up to 45% of the agents who are doing counterterrorism or doing cyber or even doing sexual exploitation crimes, and take them off those missions and stick them on immigration raids, that doesn't make any sense. And we hear back that gosh, we need to get back to these active cases we're working on. And instead, we're just extra bodies on immigration rates. So you put this all together, and I could, in my speeches on the floor of the Senate, have cited much more chapter and verse on this. And I'm, trying not to be over the top partisan, but just saying this is not making America safer. And you have seen from the president, as far back in this case to his first term, where he stood by Vladimir Putin in Helsinki, Finland, and basically agreed with the Russian president and threw our intelligence community under the bus. That kind of disdain for an independent intelligence community has been really reflected in the president's comments, in Gabbard's comments, in Secretary Hegseth's comments from the DOD side, and it's dangerous as hell.
So I want to get into why it's dangerous. But first, can you say a little bit more about what this has done to the intelligence sharing among people with whom we used to share intelligence, and what they have done, including, and I'm going to lead into this, what the fact that Colombia is no longer sharing its information with us about drug interdictions.
Well, let's start with Colombia. Colombia was, frankly, one of our greatest successes, and a lot of that goes to President Bush. It was called Plan Colombia, where we worked with the Colombian government to try to, one, help them assist in their civil war against the FARC, but most importantly, to go after the drug gangs, and we were successful. And progress. Colombia's not perfect by any means. Colombia elected a more left-wing president. Relations got worse, but they still were intelligence sharing until the president's starting to take these actions about not only threatening Venezuela, but attacking the drug boats. And again, remember, most of the drugs we're talking about still originate in Colombia or Ecuador. They don't originate in Venezuela. It is mostly all cocaine. It is not fentanyl. So that hurts us. But what is even more troubling to me is that when our strongest ally, the British, and the British punch much above their weight in terms of their intelligence gathering. They have operations in countries like Iran where they've got diplomatic relations that we don't. And in the kind of legacy of their intelligence community goes back hundreds of years. When they have said publicly they're not sure they're going to share as much because they're concerned about our actions in the Caribbean. That just doesn't happen unless they're really worried. Even earlier than that, the Dutch, who again have a very good service, first said it in the Dutch press, and now more recently have said it in the public press. They're concerned about sharing it. And I've had some of our top other partners come in, and I get to know the heads of these agencies, and they say, Mark, in a sense, what the hell's going on here? Because they're afraid that if they share a source and we don't keep that secret, that source could be exposed, oftentimes then killed, and that hurts their country as well as it hurts us. So it is really, really problematic here. And then you take that and you think about second and third world countries where the president basically taking down all of America's soft power, where we provide small, but in some cases overall important humanitarian assistance from USAID. When all of that is taken away, then in those countries they're not willing to share as much as well. So, and what we've done is, the one thing we always had, it was that as sometimes we screw up and we've made mistakes, but at the end of the day, most of the world viewed us as still kind of the good guys with all our flaws. China and Russia didn't have allies in a real sense. They had countries they could dominate or they paid off, but not real allies. The thing that is so disturbing to me, and this particularly in parts of Asia and parts of Africa in particular, but also South America, where it's now looking like China could be a more dependable, long-term, consistent partner than the United States. That is bad for our security. It's bad for our economy. And that has been exacerbated by, the president's over-the-top comments. It's been exacerbated by, kind of requiring the intelligence or wanting the intelligence community to produce products that meets his political narrative, even if that narrative is not true.
So I want to push on that just a little bit because you have spoken about the politicization of intelligence under the second Trump administration, not as a partisan problem so much as an intelligence problem, and what you're really seeing and what you've really described is the replacement of a nonpartisan service that tries to give the best possible intelligence to one that is partisan.
Well,
And
let me interrupt you there. I don't, I'm pretty frustrated with my Republican friends. Um, I wouldn't call this a partisan, making our intelligence community partisan. I would making it, try to be loyal to meet the Trump narrative. I think that is different um, than a Republican partisan. And it's one of the things that's I keep making that case, but my case gets weaker all the time when the Republicans don't stand up and push back. But I don't think it's an effort to try to say we want to be a classic Republican-driven intelligence community, more a Trump agenda.
Okay, that's an important distinction and one I often make too. That there is the traditional concept of Republican Party, and then there is Trumpism. But what you're talking about is creating an intelligence service that serves this particular administration and has fired people and is making it uncomfortable for people to offer information that doesn't meet that narrative and so on. So, what I really want to ask you about is why somebody would do that. And that's the where I'm going with that is I was fascinated by a speech that former FBI Director Robert Mueller gave in New York City in 2011, in which he talked about the emerging, what did he call it? The emerging threat, the emerging terrorist threat in the new modern 21st century. And what he argued was that what America really has to grapple with in this era is transnational organizations that are not ideological, that are not necessarily religious, but they are essentially organized crime that mixes together businesses, governments, and terrorists essentially to amass money, but also power. And I thought that was really interesting when I was reading your speech, I think it was of September, and you talked about this pushback against the constant pushback against the Russia investigation from President Trump. Because as you pointed out, it is the only report from the Senate Intelligence Committee, I believe, that was unanimously accepted by the people on that committee, including then at the time chair of the committee, Marco Rubio. So, is that what we're looking at here? An attempt to loosen the guardrails for cyber criminals, for example, for different kinds of crime across the world? Or is this just, I'm breaking it because I want to?
Well, I think it may be a little bit of both. And let me answer your question, but let me set a bit of a preface. This is not just happening with the intelligence community. This is happening across all of our government. You know, the Federal Reserve was set up to be independent of the president. The president is trying to bring the Federal Reserve and who sets interest rates under his control. We have all of the independent regulatory agencies that whoever the party in power is gets to have the majority. Think the SEC, think the commodities, CFTC, think about a host, the FCC as well, FTC, all these three-letter
I was going to
agencies
say,
that
alphabet stuff.
yeah, that's too important stuff. But they're supposed to have whoever's the president gets the majority on the commission. The minority party gets they're usually split 3-2 or ratios like that. This president has basically tried to say no, he doesn't have to adhere to the law on the role of those independent entities. So it's not just in the intelligence community that he's trying to get away from all of our traditional checks and balances. Point one. In terms of Director Mueller's comments, I think he was dead on. And let me give you some specific examples. In Russia, a number of the entities that are doing cyber crimes, they may work for the Russian intelligence services by day, but at night they're cyber criminals. So they're FSB, but then they may be also getting ransomware. Is that a nation state attacking us, or is that a criminal enterprise? That's even more so the case in China, where when we look at technology development, part of Chinese law requires that any company at the end of the day has to be first and foremost loyal to the CCP, not to their shareholders. So, and some of this again leads to corruption in the Chinese system, and there are then efforts by Americans to take advantage of that, not just from Trump, but this goes, I could talk forever on that subject. Then you've got the Trump administration, where it's the one thing you got to give him in terms of audaciousness, he does it in plain sight, where his kids are running around the world cutting deals for the Trump organization, and then that country gets preferred treatment by the administration. Their leader gets a meeting with the American president. That used to be something that was a high prestige. And we've got this the kind of ultimate example of this in recently, in terms of, on one hand, the president is saying we got to stop the narco terrorists and bomb these boats rather than interdicting them and showing the world that there's drugs and bad guys on the boats. And at the same time, somebody else appears to be paying off somebody to get the Honduran president, who is convicted in American courts of being a massive drug runner, gets him a pardon. I mean, this is really, Alice in Wonderland down the rabbit hole, in a way where our friends, our allies around the world are scratching their head. Now, back quickly to close out this part on the Russia investigation. There were so many dangling threads that we never could follow, where it appeared there might have been, much more inappropriate activity that potentially involved money. And we frankly presume that Bob Mueller, who then did his own investigation, because he was so well respected, but when he did his he didn't pursue any of those leads. So we don't know. I will say, I'm still, one of the things I'm proudest of in my time in the Senate is that 4-volume, multi-thousand-page report that has every member, from the most liberal to the most conservative, all agreeing that these were the facts. And there was nobody that would doubt that Russia was interfering in our elections. Whether they were doing that whether there was knowledge from the Trump campaign, we didn't reach a conclusion there. But the fact that they now have the director of national intelligence basically refuting everything that our intelligence community had found and saying this is all a Russia hoax, you talk about why people are losing faith in us. That's a prime example.
So, just for people who are watching, if you're interested in those volumes, they are available online, and there are wonderful, very short summaries at the beginning of each of them. So you don't have to read the thousands and thousands of pages there. I think the summaries are about 1.5 to 2.5 pages. They're very clear, and they lay out what was happening. So if you want to look at them, you can see in the table of contents where those summaries are, and they're really quick, easy reads. So before I let you go, I don't feel like we can finish talking today without talking a little bit about what on earth is going on in the waters around Venezuela. And especially now, this new information that we appear to have that came out last night about a standing order that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth wrote. I know today you're about to go hear from Admiral Bradley, who was the person in charge of special operations that did that, apparently gave the order for the double tap strike on September 2nd. And what I'm really curious about is how much of any of this have the intelligence committees been apprised of? And if not, is there A, concern about that, but B, a plan to do something about it?
Well, one, in terms of the overall actions, it has been minimal at best. We've been briefed a couple of times. The decision was taken in late July to start these strikes. It's never been fully explained. And incredibly, 90% of the strikes are in the Caribbean. 95% of the cocaine is actually going through the Eastern Pacific. So if it was really about the drug flows, it wouldn't be where they're striking. And frankly, the point I keep making I know we've got some visibility and the drug cartels are awful and we ought to do all we can to go after them. But we'd be a hell of a lot better in terms of how we're viewed, not only in America, but around the world, if we said, well, let's stop these boats and show the world the drugs and show the world the bad guys on the boats, as opposed to blowing up. And you've got Hegseth, who again, he's having a rough week because the inspector general said his earlier malfeasance around using signal chat personal phones with classified information put our troops in harm's way. That came out in the last 48 hours. And now we've got this evidence where Hegseth initially bragged about overseeing and commanding this whole strike on September 2nd. And now, as the facts come out, he says, well, maybe he was not fully in command or he didn't issue. And I'm just hoping from Admiral Bradley that we'll hear the truth. And again, this could have been totally cleared up if they would have released the unedited video of the strike on day one. So this is really problematic. So let's break this quickly into the category of their actions against the drug cartels. And again, the drug cartels are, as Mueller would have said, they're not ideological. They're all about making money, but they're willing to, kill people and do awful things to make that money. That is a separate discussion from the question about Venezuela. And let me be clear, Maduro is a bad guy, and I am very critical of what the Biden administration didn't do when the Venezuelan people voted overwhelmingly, 65% plus, to throw out Maduro. Biden didn't put near enough pressure on Colombia, Brazil, Mexico to push him out, and we missed that opportunity. That doesn't then, though, give the president the ability to say, all right, we're going to close off their airspace, we're going to start bombing them. And since this has been in this slow build-up process for months, he's got no ability, without telling Congress what his plan is, to take these actions. There's nothing that's been approved. He's not even asked for authority. And the way you grant the president a little bit of grace if he has to act quickly is when it was the secret strike against Iran, where again they didn't brief the Democrats initially, they only briefed the Republicans, for when an adversary takes an action and you've got to act quickly. This has been a slow-moving buildup for months on end, and if the president would start striking Venezuela, he has no authority or approval from Congress or anyone else, and he's not even fully made the case.
Right. So the strikes themselves are already problematic, but then you also have now this apparent double tap strike, which even under their own justification is outside the bounds of that.
This may have been 4 strikes, not even just 2.
Right.
So we'll get more of that into the close of business today.
And so, is this of concern in the intelligence committees or in Congress in general?
It is the one time, I think, again, where we're starting to see my Republican friends, at least on the Armed Services Committee, say we got to investigate this. I hear, because a lot of the sailors who are down in the Caribbean right now are home ported out of Norfolk, Virginia.
Right.
So we get calls, literally my office gets calls from parents saying, my son or daughter down there potentially doing something that could get them in legal jeopardy if they're violating, the law of war, that you're not supposed to kill people that are non-combatants, that are clearly not, still a threat. And I can't answer those questions yet. And that is deeply concerning to me. And then on top of that, they've got questions saying, Venezuela has not got a huge military by any means, but are my kids going to be in harm's way if we strike Venezuela? And why are we doing that? And the president has not made the case other than that Maduro's a bad guy and 50 nations, including ours, don't recognize his government. But there's a lot of other bad guys and gals around the world that we don't send an aircraft carrier fleet down to strike.
So I'm going to let you go, but it's funny, as I'm listening to you talk, it all seems to me to boil down to that very simple adage, right? That knowledge is power. And the fact that the United States had access to such extraordinary knowledge through allies around the world made us powerful. And now that you're operating in the dark, that we are operating in the dark, you can watch that power slipping away. I guess the question is, to whom is it slipping? And what does that mean for the American people at the end of the day?
Well, it means that we are not as informed, number one, as policymakers. Number two, it means that our allies have less faith in us. And number three, the job of the intelligence community is not to make a policy decision. It's not to decide strike Venezuela or not, or go after, drug runners or not. That's up to the elected officials or the folks in the administration to try to make the case. But their job is to tell the truth. And if analysts are bending the truth to try to meet the political desires of the president, then we're kind of screwed. And then all of that information gathering carries a political taint. And if the policymaker says, well, I'm not sure I trust this anymore, that makes Americans less safe. And they should be, whether they're supporters of the president or not, you got to have the willingness that the adage in the Intelligence Committee, speak truth to power. If that truth is being corrupted, America is less safe, and that should not happen.
If you were going to tell people one thing that they could do or something they could do to express their concern about this, what would you ask them to do?
I would ask them, one, to vote in next year's elections, because I think until we get some balance of power back in Congress, we're not going to be held accountable. And I would ask particularly if they're represented by Republicans, to please try to talk to their senators and congressmen and say, even if they agree with the president on some of his policy items, in terms of our national security, there should be no partisan politics. Or there should not even be, in partisan is, again, we get using the misword, there should be not Trumpism versus the traditional speaking truth to power.
Well, this has been a real pleasure, and I hope we can do it again. I would love to talk to you about the history of the Norfolk Navy Yard, which is storied and important. And I wish you luck up there on the Hill for the rest of the week. It seems like it's going to be lit. And I appreciate your trying to preserve our intelligence community at its best, which has always been so important to the country. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your interest. I know it's a little nerdy, but boy, it's really important. The men and women in the intelligence community never get the attention that, say, our military does, but boy, oh boy, they do a damn good job. And I feel like they're under such stress right now. These are not partisan individuals.
If I had it to do over again, I would go into intelligence in the State Department. I find what they do absolutely fascinating, and the reports that come out of there are the best of the best. So I agree with you, and think highlighting them is a great thing. So thank you for being here, and thank you everybody for being here, and we'll hope to talk to you again soon.